We're going to get started again. I'm going to start with questions that are up here, and they take us just back a teeny little step here. First, let's go back through what the exams are. The International Baccalaureate is a form of, gives a form of credit by exam that we've handled already pretty much as a system. And I want to emphasize that part of the reason we handled IB as a system was that the legislature threatened to make the decision for us if we didn't. And you need to consider that it is possible that there could be some kind of legislative pressure on us to make decisions about AP, CLEP, and Dante's. So I think it's a good idea to get out ahead of this before the legislature is telling us what to do, because inevitably a legislator has a child that had a 3 on an AP exam and didn't get credit somewhere. So we want to get your opinion on these. And you've got some good questions here, but let's go back through. So AP means a student took a course in high school and then took an exam, and their score may or may not qualify them for college credit. The CLEP program, which a lot of you are familiar with, is a standardized program. I believe it's run by the College Board, the same people that gave us the SAT. And it's a series of standardized exams to see whether students have knowledge equivalent to taking a course. CLEP doesn't imply that they took any course. They could have read a textbook. They could have just studied for it. But essentially, the question is, in the end, is their knowledge equivalent to that of a knowledge of students who have actually taken a course? And the last is Dante's, or now called DSST. This one started as a military test aimed at partly at converting the types of knowledge that people might acquire in the military in different occupations to see whether it was equivalent to coursework. It's a little bit more specialized. It still has some military connections, but Dante's was bought by a company called Prometric. They now offer it not just to military, but to many others. It's known now as DSST. A big advantage of DSST is, I believe, that military members can take it for free. So that's a factor if you're a military-friendly institution. But so essentially, we've got AP, CLEP, and DSST to consider. And then the question is, what do the ACE recommendations mean? Well, we all have these suspicions. AP puts out this test. They tell us that a score of 3 is good, or CLEP puts out this test. They tell us that a score of 400 is good. Is that really true? So what ACE has done is they have teams that they've appointed for each of these tests. They review the test, they review the scoring, and they say, well, in our opinion, a student who gets this score has knowledge that's comparable to a student who took a college course of this type and made a C or higher on it. So if I haven't addressed that question, just come back to it. The next question is, would a RAC recommendation not to have test out be acceptable, especially for criminal justice? A lot of people want to have no test out options, and I don't know the criminal justice field, so I can't really give a great answer to this. Again, what you need to think about is if you had a student that transferred in a grade from a course like this, that they got a C at another institution, would you accept it? Then you should probably at least consider these. And we're really not, in general, we're not talking about upper level courses. There are some exceptions. We're talking about very basic. Now, criminal justice is a little bit of an exception because I believe it's DSST that has a richer portfolio, and one issue might be whether we offer a comparable course. It's hard to give credit if the course we offer isn't comparable, and that is coming up in another question. So I'm kind of going to come back to that. How are the RAC recommendations going to be used? Are they binding on institutions? They are not binding on institutions. They are recommendations. Certainly, I think that the system office intends to try to leverage the recommendations, but awarding of credit is an institutional decision. But what we want to try to do is get something that's a little bit more rational, because what we have now is a situation where a student can get credit, we'll say, for a CLEP test. They got a score on a CLEP test. They came to one USG institution who awarded them credit for, let's say, English 101. And now they transfer to another institution and they actually lose the credit for English 101 because the other institution has a different standard. There's just a desire to bring a little bit more of a rational approach and to essentially ask people to justify, or ask institutions to justify some of their decisions, which we haven't been able to do yet because we hadn't had the RACs look at these tests and make their recommendations. So they will not be binding on it. I'm clear that they will not be binding on institutions, but I'd be lying to you if I didn't tell you that, yeah, we're going to use them to try to bring some rationality to this process across the system. Okay, and I'm having a little trouble scrolling through my, okay, this question from Jennifer Trunzo: what if the DSST asks questions that aren't covered in the intro level courses? She looked at the anthropology DSST last spring, and this is a difficult question because I remember long ago being asked to evaluate the AP psychology test for with my institution. And I have to say there wasn't much overlap between what was offered in AP psychology and what we offered in intro psych. And we were really stymied by that, particularly because we already knew that other institutions offered credit for Psych 101 for a score of 3 or higher, or sometimes for a score of 4 or higher, and we felt it wasn't a very good match. But on the other hand, a student transferring credit in for a Psych 101 taken at another institution may not have a very good match. I'm not really sure what you should do in that case, but what Jennifer says here, that in the case of the DSST anthropology course, its content that was more likely to be covered in upper level courses, that survey method and theory. That is a good argument. I think that it's not a good match, but I'd like to have you lean in general on the side of trying to say, how can we make this work? But if you really can't make it work, you can't make it work, and you should provide just a good explanation, as Jennifer has provided here in the chat. And Eddie Namias has said IB is the most rigorous and impressive curriculum for high schoolers. High scores on IB are better than high scores on AP. And I don't know very much about IB, but we have worked it out, so we're giving very substantial credit based on IB here. Okay, if I haven't dealt adequately with your questions, just ask again. I'd like to go a little further forward and see if we can explicate some of this. So yeah, what we're looking for, to sum up where we are, is a recommendation for each test as to the minimum score to award credit, and for how much credit and what courses when possible. And I'll give some examples of that. Oops. Okay, so these are some examples of what ACE has recommended. And again, so ACE is reviewing the tests as a group of faculty members and saying, okay, we're faculty members, we know what an intro biology course is like. We're looking at this test and saying that students with a certain score probably have skills or knowledge comparable to students who finished 2 semesters of biology with a grade of C or higher. So their ACE is just sort of a third-party evaluator. They don't award credit, they just evaluate and recommend how much credit and for what. And usually they're pretty standard, but you'll find there are a few places where they veer out of line and require higher scores. All right, so what we're hoping for you guys to do is create a generic recommendation, minimum score to award credit, amount of credit to be awarded, and specific course credit if you've got common numbered courses, or a description of the type of course. It's possible for you to disagree with the ACE recommendations, but please justify your recommendation. That'll at least be progress for us if we get that far. Now, and I'm going to show you some examples. These are made, well, they're sort of semi-made up. I'm not telling you what to recommend. I just had to have some examples here. So let's suppose that the psychology committee looks at the AP psychology tests. They decide in line with ACE, they're going to recommend a score of 3 or higher. We've got a common number for the introductory psychology course. So they're going to recommend credit for Psych 1 101, which is 3 credit hours. Now, some of the tests end up being equivalent to 1 course, or at least that's your best guess. Like, we don't have an early sequence in psychology at most institutions. But in history, we have some sequence courses. So following the same logic, and again, I am not trying to tell history what to do here. This is purely an example because it was a good example. So I should have written, this is the US history test. So if you look at the AP US history, ACE recommends with a score of 3 or higher that you get credit. And you might recommend specifically that a student with a score of 3 or higher on the US history test get credit for either History 2110, if that's offered at your institution, or History 2111 or 2112, which would be 6 credit hours. And I think either one of those is possible. ACE doesn't do it in this case, but you could even say, okay, if you get a 3, you get credit for 1. If you get a 4, you get credit for both, recognizing that the US History AP course covers both of the time periods for 2111 or 2112. So one is not more logical than the other, but you might want to find a way to give more credit to students with outstanding scores. That's a little different from the ACE recommendation, which is, I believe, 6 credit hours for 3, for a score of 3 or higher. When you get to foreign language, the ACE recommendations are very interesting, because here they've got different amounts of credit recommended for different scores. So, and you could do the same. I dropped in our common course numbers here, which of course ACE doesn't have. But so a student with score 3 might get credit for 1001 and 1002. 4 might get credit for 1001, 1002, and 2001, and 5 might give you credit for 12 credit hours for essentially 1001 through 2002. Again, that's what ACE is recommending. I'm just using that as an example. Now, here I picked art history because we don't have a common numbered course for art history or art appreciation. And that's on my wish list, which we'll talk about later. But here, if you got a score of 3 or higher, ACE recommends 6 credit hours. But I don't know what we would recommend for. So you'd have to, rather than recommending for a particular, as a RAC, you can't recommend for a particular course because there is no common numbered course, but you might recommend a type of credit, and not for AP, but for some of the other tests, ACE will say for a lower level course in blah, 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 or an upper level course in something. But the idea is your recommendations will be institution independent based on your best scholarship and knowledge as faculty members in the discipline. So essentially, you're doing something comparable to what ACE has done. You're reviewing and the test and recommending credit thresholds, amounts of credit, and where possible, the specific courses for which credit could be awarded. Your recommendations will not be binding on the institution, but will certainly be shared with institutions in an effort to get this kind of in line. And I'm trying to see, okay. So I'm looking at questions, and you can feel free to type more in. Beth Howells is asking, will I be sharing the slides with it? Yes, I will share the slide deck. I'll figure out where to post it and share it with you. The Delynn Williams, RAC had the discussions, could not agree on a score. This is the political science committee, by the way. Score of 3 or 4. We do look at statistical data, but we've done this for AP. For political science, I think, I'm trying to remember what all tests there are, but we'd be predominantly looking for something comparable to American government. There might be some other ones as well. It's hard to get data. The best way to get data is part of what's already been done. If you look at AP courses where a lot of students will take follow-on courses, you look and see how AP students do in the follow-on courses, and that's that AP validity study that I linked to. But what you find is it's incredibly difficult to get data on follow-on courses. This is the issue that Delynn is raising here. Students with a score of 4 or 3, do they struggle in the upper division coursework? Trying to see the rest of this. I guess, so there is the question is, are they going to be adequately prepared, particularly when we're looking at CLEP or DSST? I'll say when we're looking at AP, we're usually looking at students who are at the top in their high school or that wouldn't be taking AP courses. And I believe that the validation study showed that in general, on the courses that they could study, that they did very well. I think part of the issue to think about here is, and this is true with transfer courses too, essentially, if the student already has achieved at least C-level mastery, if they took a course in, let's say, American government and they got a C, we'd let them go on. They probably wouldn't be the top of their class in their further courses, but they're going to be allowed to go on. If we don't award credit for the student who earns a 3 on the AP, then essentially they're going to have to retake the course, which they may have already substantially mastered, if not mastered. And that's where, at a certain point, we're likely to attract unwanted attention. That isn't the only reason we should look at it, but the choice is really, in many cases, are we going to make students retake what they've already shown they can do, at least at the level of a C? Now, again, a student who gets a C in an entry-level course is probably not really well positioned to go on, but it happens, including with our courses at our own institutions. So try to filter it through that. You know, this is real life. It's not perfect. I'd love it if every student got a 5 on an AP exam and then did splendidly as they move on. But I also know not every student in an entry-level course is going to get an A and really have the mastery that they need to go on successfully. So in an imperfect academic world, what is a good approximation to fairness and equity and reasonableness? We're not going to get perfection, I know that. And I'm going to look over these questions later at more length, because you've raised some really good issues. And I take seriously the issues that I know are going to come up, but I just want you guys to take seriously the idea of, you know, can we do better? Can we establish a standard of reasonableness? You know, in psychology, in my background in psychology, we like to talk about good enough, like there's good enough mothering. I think the concept of good enough is a useful one. So what is good enough in academia? Is it a score of 3 on an AP test? You may have important reasons for saying that it's not. Just, I want you to kind of approach it this way. And if you really disagree, let me know. But if you can find a way that you can make this work, I think that's really helpful. Okay, any more questions on this before we move on? Okay, well, I thank you, because I know this is a difficult one to hear. All right. Okay, now, we also have some other things that are not as important as this, but that you might consider if you want to know some priorities that we have. If you haven't seen it in the Academic and Student Affairs Handbook, there's a big long list. I gave you the link to it. It's section 2.4.10. I have it engraved on my left hand, so I never forget it. We have a list of common course prefixes, titles, and descriptions, and a lot of these have been here forever, but believe it or not, they were, I think, originally developed by RACs. And some of them need a little bit of tweaking, and we could probably use some new ones. I'm going to do a deeper dive into that in a minute, but this is just a preview of the next 4 areas. The area of course guidelines for every discipline that your committee is over. And some of you have already been looking at those, which I appreciate. Review or make math pathway recommendations, and Jonathan Watts Hull will be talking to you about that. And on occasion, provide informed comments and reviews of course proposals that go to the Council on General Education or new programs proposed by USG institutions. And we'll do a little deeper dive into each of those 4 in a minute. Okay, the common course prefixes, numbers, and descriptions. Some of you have been surprised when you look to see what was listed for your discipline, because it's just been there forever, and some of this may not even be in use. I'd like you to take a look at the courses that are logically attached to your discipline, and see if you want to make some additions or changes. I've made some suggestions to some of them, to some of you in the charges to your committees. When you look at the list, it looks kind of like this. This is a pretty good example. Here we have accounting and some introduction to some anthropology courses. The numbers are fine. You see that for accounting, we at least have a course description. For the anthropology, we don't have a course description. It would be nice to have a course description. I will say, when the Council on General Education reviews proposals for courses, like let's suppose we get a ANTH 1103 proposal, one of the things we look for is to see whether the course description for the course being proposed matches the common course description that's here. So a common course description also gives some guidance to institutions that are trying to establish a new course. I will say, without leaning on it too heavily, because we're kind of on a pause on Gen Ed redesign, I think common numbered courses are going to be part of the key to Gen Ed redesign. Sorry, I'm seeing ANTH 1103 doesn't exist at any institution. You might want to delete it then. But I think a key to Gen Ed redesign is going to be buffing up these common course descriptions, adding some additional material like expected learning outcomes and a common course outline, and in some way getting pre-approval from the Council on General Education that institutions can offer courses matching this description without going through the full approval process. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Okay, here I see, is some of this difficult to do when we're looking at a new core? Does it make sense to make recommendations to change Area F? I think if you have the will to do it, that looking at the common number courses is worthwhile, because in the process that I envision, which may or may not happen, it'll be easier to get common numbered courses included in the redesigned Gen Ed. So if your discipline has courses that meet all the criteria, they'll get added to the new categories early on. But even before we go to new Gen Ed, we're piloting a process to try to see if we can get the Council on General Education to approve a course, let's say for most Area Ds, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of recommendations to change Area F, the way I looked at what was going on with Gen Ed redesign, Area F was going to be field of study courses, and the main change that was being proposed was introduction of the written communication in the discipline component. So if you make allowances for the fact that that might happen, if you want to do your Area F right now, I think that's fine, because we don't know how long it'll be before Gen Ed redesign could possibly take place. So, and because Gen Ed redesign wasn't doing much to change field of study, I think you could feel comfortable with that. Now let me give you an example. Well, actually, a couple things here. Okay, so I've already written you about this. On my wish list, I would love to have common course prefixes, numbers, and descriptions for African American history. The Council on General Education had suggested that, we've got the, what is it? World Civilization, US history sequences, that there might be an African American history sequence. Anatomy and Physiology 1 and 2 and microbiology are offered at most institutions, but we don't have a common number. For fine and applied arts, we would love to have an art history or art appreciation or both, and a film appreciation. We don't have common numbers for any biology courses that are not that are for non-science majors. We'd love to see environmental science and humanities writ capital H. So we've already got a lot of other humanities courses, but there are courses offered as humanities courses at many institutions, and it would be nice to have a couple, one or two, just common numbered courses. And going back up here, Introduction to Data Science. In anticipation of several different things that have been going on, we have worked as a system, working with a group of faculty and department chairs to develop an outline for an Introduction to Data Science course. Now, College of Coastal Georgia proposed a course that was approved by the Council on General Education that meets this basic criterion. And we took that and worked with them and with the course outline to create a generic Introduction to Data Science outline. This outline will be presented to the Council on General Education in October. We're going to see if this new process works. The intent is to ask the Council on General Education to approve this course that could be offered at any institution whose Area D learning outcomes would fit with this course, where once the course is approved by the council, an institution wanting to offer it would just have to notify the council that they were doing so and just show that it coordinates with their learning outcome. The other vision for this is, as you probably all know, there was a data fluency, data science component of proposed Gen Ed redesign, and we're also hoping that this could be like one of the first courses approved for that. And if it's approved to satisfy that requirement, it could be offered at any institution. Now, why I'm making a big deal about this is right now, if you want to offer even, let's say Math 101, you haven't been offering it at your institution, it's a common numbered course offered at many institutions. But if it's new to your institution and you want to offer it in Area A2, right now you have to write up a proposal, a full proposal. It has to be sent off to the math committee for review and then reviewed by the Council on General Education, which will almost certainly say yes. But right now, essentially every time a new course gets put in the core, an individual institution has to propose it and get it approved. We are hoping to move more to a process, and this is a process that could start right now before Gen Ed redesign, where we could pre-approve common numbered courses to meet certain requirements. So I'll know more after the October council meeting, but essentially what we're hoping, we could go back and the council could go back and pre-approve some of the other common numbered courses to meet existing requirements and get them essentially as part of this effort. In order to do that, you'd probably have to flesh out what we know about the common numbered courses. And you can decide whether or not it's worth your effort at this point. So I have this wish list of new courses I'd like to see. I didn't mention the Integrated Science and Math 2008 because I think we're halfway through the process on that, and I'll just get back to the committees. I think I dropped the ball in the middle of the course, but those are de facto common numbered courses in the Ed Prep program. We just don't have them listed as common numbered courses, and I think I'm supposed to take the next steps to get that done. So it's on the list, but you don't at the moment have to worry about it. Any questions on the common numbered courses? Okay, Area Fs. When I look at the, again, I've given you a link. When I look at the Area F guide, the link to the Area F guidelines, couple things to point out. If you had Area F learning outcomes, it used to be they were in one place on the web, and then your Area F course guidelines were in another place on the web. If I had both from your group, I put them together, and now they're linked together in one place because your Area F learning outcomes should be related to your Area F course guidelines. So they're all on one page here, and but I think we've got some Area Fs that maybe no longer even exist. For instance, physical therapy isn't an undergraduate level curriculum anymore, I don't think. So you might take a look at the Area Fs and see if we still have all of the programs that are represented. See if we need some new Area Fs, or if the Area F guidelines need rethinking. In some cases, we have Area F guidelines that are just for one institution, which may or may not be helpful. But anyway, so take a look at the list and make recommendations if there are guidelines we need to get rid of. Look to see if you feel urgently that your area of guidelines need revising. And I go back to Beth Howell's question, does it make sense to make recommendations to change area F? I think if you discover things that you're really unhappy with, it still makes sense to change area F, because right now, if I look in my crystal ball, I don't see Gen Ed redesign being implemented earlier than fall of 2003, and maybe not even then. So assuming we have 3 years, I don't think we want to delay needed improvements for 3 whole years. And again, that's not an official timeline, that is crystal balling. Okay, any questions on area F?
Barbara, can I
Yeah.
go back and ask you
Sure.
a question about
Yeah.
what you were talking about previously? So foreign language courses are accepted at some institutions in area B and in some institutions in area C.
Right.
Does this mean at the system level that they have automatically been accepted to both, and that then it's up to the institution to decide whether to put it in B or C, or how does that work?
Okay. Basically, if a student finishes area B and includes foreign language and they transfer to another institution, they've finished area B, including the foreign language, even if the new institution doesn't offer foreign language in area B. So in that sense, yes. But in the other sense, if an institution wants to put a foreign language in area B or C, right now, they have to send that proposal to the Council on General Education, and the council has to approve it specifically for area B or C or both. And they don't always do that, especially if the foreign language doesn't seem to line up with the learning outcomes for that area. So they don't, it's not a rubber stamp kind of thing. One of the things I kind of hope that we'll resolve in Gen Ed redesign is where we can put foreign languages automatically. And I don't envision that we'll be dictating institutions, but we'll be saying, okay, it's pre-approved for this area. If you want to put it here, you can do it.
And then can I ask you a follow-up question?
Yeah.
From a meeting we had previously where, as Dr. Denley was talking, a lot of what he was saying could be applied to foreign languages. For example, that high school students take 4 years of math, but they're still not prepared, and so they need a math in the core, right? Yeah. And they take 4 years of English, but they're not prepared, so they need an English in the core. Yet we don't allow students to take 2 years of foreign language and then count 1,000 level foreign language in the core. It does not make sense to me.
Actually, we do allow them to do it at some institutions.
So
the council used to not approve 1001 for inclusion in the core, but they routinely do now. And they have, under some circumstances, given institutions permission to go back and add that to their core.
Okay, yeah, because we used to have it in our core, and it was, with the consolidation, it was removed. So the system does not have any opposition to that.
No.
Okay.
No. You'd be working right now. You'd be working primarily with the council, but again, I'd love to have some guidelines where the council doesn't have to adjudicate every single one of these things, because it's a common question that should have a common answer. Okay. And Eric, regarding your question earlier about 15%, I'm going to correspond with you separately, but I think I know where that came from. I think it was a SAC COC thing.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Denley indicated to you it wasn't a system office thing. Anyway, that's an aside, but I have a note to correspond with you on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. All right, any questions on area Fs?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if the RACs are determining, I guess, learning outcomes and course guidelines for area Fs,
yeah.
then what is the role of the general general or the Council on General Education in that process?
Okay, the council mostly looks at courses to be added to areas A through E. When changes are made to area F, the RAC proposes them to the council, which reviews them just to make sure that they're kind of aligned with system and just to make sure they make sense, and then sends them on to the VPAAs, which has to give them final approval. But basically, this is something that's evolved over a period of years. The RACs set the guidelines for Area F, and council doesn't look at any courses, specific courses to be added at specific institutions to Area F. They assume that the institutions will be that they'll comply with the guidelines you've established, which is not always the case. So the council will look at, if you propose 6 courses for Area F, they'll look, or let's say you propose 12, they'll look at that and say, okay, this all makes sense. We're going to send it on to the VPAAs. And then the expectation is that you guys are kind of governing Area F, that you're checking to make sure that the institutions Area F's comply overall with the guidelines that you established. Did that get your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay.
I have a quick question.
Moment of
about Area F.
excitement. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question regarding Area F is, where does human services fall? Because for the schools that offer it within the USG system, that's part of sociology, at least at the intro level, but many of them break off into their own prefix. And so there's been discussion within departments that have human services programs, who governs that? Like, is that sociology? Is it social work? Or what? Do we need a new RAC for that? Or what needs to happen with that? Because there doesn't seem to be any RAC governance in regards to this.
Okay, there are Area Fs that we don't have guidelines for. I'm wondering if sociology and human services could get together as a committee, because social work and human services, because social work recently broke off from anthropology, sociology, and social work to address those issues. And it seems to me that maybe the social work committee could expand to include human services and could set up, they've got a social work Area F, maybe they could set up a human services Area F. But it's true not, and just send me a proposal for how you'd like to handle it. I mean, there are gaps in the Area F, and some of them we need to address, and some of them probably we don't need to. This sounds like one we need to address. I see a question here, where do we find the information on Area F learning outcomes for a particular RAC committee? When you go to on your agenda where it says Area F's learning outcomes and course guidelines, if you click on that, it won't be for a particular RAC committee, but presumably you're going to be seeing the product of your RAC. So if you click on, philosophy is always my poster child because they've done a nice job. If you click on philosophy, you'll see the learning outcomes at the top and the course guidelines at the bottom. Or English, I know, has both the learning outcomes and the course guidelines. In some cases, there are no learning outcomes because we didn't get them. Somebody from the system office asked for learning outcomes, pretty sure it was 15 years ago, without explaining what they were intended to do, and they got some learning outcomes and others not. So you may or may not have them, but if you have them for your committee, they're at that link. Okay, anybody else?
Yes, I have a question. Our RAC Committee for Psychology discussed what we had in our Area Fs, and they weren't at all similar. And what I noticed was that some programs had changed their area Fs to help accommodate the momentum year. So having a certain number of classes that they would have contact with in the first year.
Right.
So we made 2,000 level psychology classes available in area F, and other programs didn't. Do we, when we work on this, if we work on this together, do we still need to try to do something to accommodate the idea of momentum year within area F?
That's a really good question. The way we specified for momentum year was we said 9 credit hours sort of in your intended field of study. And the complication with that is area F is the one area that's not transferable if you change majors. So if students take 9 hours in psychology and then become a math major, they essentially have 9 hours that they probably can't count. I don't think we've ever fully resolved that, but the other thing is the 9 hours don't have to be entirely in area F, although I see the attractiveness of that. I would say that the area Fs are still supposed to be within the guidelines that were provided by the committee, and I think that psychology had said up to intro psych, and I think up to 9 credit hours in psychology, so you're probably still within it. You know, psychology was written very broadly because I was on that committee in 2005. So you may be okay, and you're sort of kind of the enforcement, the RACs are kind of sort of the enforcement mechanism for area Fs. And if you want to take this on, one thing you could do is at one of your meetings, have everybody bring in their area Fs, put them up on a screen, review them, discuss them, identify whether there are issues. There's sort of a gentle enforcement process. So the first thing to do is talk it out with the institutions and try to get them voluntarily to be in compliance. But you sort of have to decide how you're going to handle that. We purposely didn't put any tough enforcement mechanism in there because we're afraid nobody would want to use it. Others on that?
What about FYE in Area F? I mean, a lot of the Area F guidelines say no orientation courses, but they're with the move with momentum year, it seems like there's been a push to include some area or FYE type courses in Area Fs.
I'm trying to remember what the Area F curricular guidelines say. I don't think that FYE courses are forbidden in that area, but basically the RAC would have to pronounce on that. I will say on the FYE courses, the council, and I'll send you the link to this, but the Council on General Education recognizes that it would be desirable to put first year experience courses if they're seminar type courses in the core, and had developed some guidelines for putting them in area B. They would probably still be good guidelines if you're looking at area F. That is, they have to be collegiate, not really strictly an orientation course. There are a bunch of other guidelines that they wrote. I'll share that with you. I do think we can't keep adding requirements outside the core. And, you know, to the extent that FYE courses are desirable, I think we should be trying to bring them in, but we're still working with kind of old guidelines. But it's not something that I would write off. You know, if you could have a really meaningful FYE course that's discipline specific, it could, I think you could put it in area F. You just have to get your area F guidelines, and they may already be written so broadly that you can accommodate that. A lot of area F guidelines are big enough to drive a truck through. Others? Okay, now the moment you've been waiting for, where somebody other than me talks. And I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Watts Hull, who's our Director for Student Success. I'm a little worried about his first slide because it's black. I think it comes from the evil empire here. But he is going to talk about the issue of making recommendations for math for your discipline, essentially, which has been an ongoing project for several years. And so, Jonathan, take it away and tell me when you want me to advance your slides.
Sure, and I think we'll go ahead. Again, thank you, Barbara, for having me. Thank you all. It's good to see y'all, or see some of y'all, and to be here with y'all. We'll go ahead and stick to the black for just a second. I want to take this moment of personal privilege just to sort of go back to the momentum question, because I want to, I think Barbara covered it pretty well. I just want to note that there are programs in which it is easier or more difficult to introduce a student to their discipline, what that discipline is like in their first year. The idea of 9 credits in your program of study is intended to do 2 things. One, it's intended to imbue that student's study with purpose. So as a RAC, think about what the discipline looks like at the end point, and how would you want to prepare a student? What would the experience be at the beginning to make sure that that student knows that by the time they get to their 3rd and 4th year of study, this is what the courses look like, this is what the discipline demands. And the other thing is there is a really important point, particularly for our students who come in without the habitus of going to college, coming from communities where they're predominantly first-generation students and things like that, that we want to make sure that they understand the full scope of their options and choices, and so that is part of this element about how we want to expose students in their first year to what their chosen academic discipline is. And so just think about that. If you've got your RAC, many of our programs have introductory courses and then move into an like a second tier course. That's fine. If you're a discipline where that doesn't exist, it's most common in business and sometimes in education. Think about what that early experience would be like and make that recommendation. Again, we aren't asking for a course in Area F necessarily. These may be other people's courses that make sense within the context of your program, but just that's sort of the broader goal of that. And I want to sort of keep that up there, because the idea of a specific set of courses is not a new curriculum. It doesn't add, and there are generally actually courses that are already in your curriculum, and sometimes it's just a matter of sequencing. So Barbara, we can actually skip through the move out of the forces of darkness and into the powers of light. I want to talk a bit about math pathways. So I've been doing math pathways. The system is doing math pathways for about 5-6 years now. We've actually been doing it for longer than that, but we've been focused on it in a way about the intentional way in which we're expanding these pathways for several years now. Barbara, if you move on. One of the genesis for this is actually with the ACMS. The math RAC that sort of notes that math should be aligned with your discipline. And we've had this discussion back in the early 2000s, where the national RACs got together and they had this really fun little thing on Crafty, the curriculum renewal across the first 2 years. It says that the skills taught in college algebra weren't really appropriate. So for disciplines outside STEM, and essentially the thing is, if you've got college algebra in your program, it's leading towards calculus, because college algebra is preparatory to calculus. And one of the things we know from our research is, from our looking at our curriculum, is we were overplacing students in college algebra. So one of the things we sort of highlighted was we had really 4 math pathways. So Barbara, the next slide, the 4 math pathways, they go from, we have a STEM pathway, which is that sort of pre-calc, trig, starting somewhere there, going into calculus. Georgia Tech, you start in calculus, and then you go on to more calculus. For students who are in, and then they're non-STEM majors, some of whom will have calculus in their program. And so there's some pre-calc or calculus in a program. So this is specific to business, where those programs go towards business calc, and we understand that there will be some need to have that fundamental background in college algebra. And so students may start in college algebra or pre-calculus, and then they move on to either business calculus and so that's sort of an understanding and expectation. Then there's like everybody else. And everybody else, the role is like, basically we have math modeling and quantitative reasoning. They can take college algebra if they want. And then they move into what is generally more thought of as a statistics model. Now that's where we were until this fall. And so we have now expanded this for some institutions. There are 14 institutions at which there are actually 5 math pathways. And Barbara, if you advance on, the 5th math pathway is actually a statistics pathway. It's not fully fleshed out, but it are 14 institutions that are participating in this prototype. They are offering elementary statistics, the math 1401 or statistics 1401, as an area A2 math. That is a fully transferable math. One of the agreements at the system-wide is that if a student takes it and advances beyond it, that is their area A2 math. Does not mean that if a course, that math course is not in their program of study, require it for something else, they would, there's an opportunity for them to take another math, but that is an area A2 math, and that leads into either more statistics or data science. And we began with this program with the RACs last year, talking about is statistics a better starting point for you in your discipline. So I think what I'd like to do, Barbara, is skip all the way down to sort of this default math. I want to sort of rip through this. There's a couple of slides you'll see, but these will be available to you, but I don't think we need to really delve into them. But I want to talk about this. This is actually what I think is really important. Is like noted earlier that college algebra was our default math. 70% of our students were taking college algebra about 5 years ago as their first math these are students among the 3 math courses. So anybody who placed above, like in a 11, 12, or 11, 13, placing into pre-calc, college or trig, those or calculus and above, accepting those out. But students who are being placed in what we would consider a gateway math, area A2 gateway math, college algebra, quantitative math, 70% were going into college algebra, and those students, that's a really high number, particularly for knowing what we know about that course and its alignment with other disciplines. This has been slowly edging away, but you can look right now, we're at about 50% of all students. And what this includes is students who are both STEM and non-STEM. Now, understanding many of our STEM students start in pre-calc or above. So this is simply students who are coming into their gateway. And so you're seeing this big shift, and we expect that this will continue to change, because this is actually what this is a realignment in the way we're thinking about math. So I want to thank both the math folks who have done a great deal of yeoman's work on this, as well as the RAC discipline group so far, to work with advising. Now, here's why we have a math pathway. Math pathways are not recommendations, or are not requirements, but they're recommendations, and they're really helpful because students don't stay at one school. If a student didn't transfer, a math pathway wouldn't be all that significantly important. But one of the things we want to make sure that one of the reasons why, in this case, you're seeing such a high level of college algebra was historically thought of as the safe math. In other words, it would always transfer no matter where you went. It would always count in the program, and students would not lose credit. And advisors were really risk averse when they're talking to students about the decisions they would make about their courses to make sure they would transfer. One of the realities is there was no transparency, no visibility in terms of how other maths were being accepted across at other institutions. That has changed. It has changed largely because we have really had a great deal of support from institutions and from RACs about identifying the maths that would be acceptable within their disciplines. So skipping in just to make sure we're all clear what we mean by an algebra pathway. An algebra pathway starts with college algebra. It goes to pre-calculus, goes to calculus, and then goes to more calculus perhaps. It is intended to get students started in calculus and moving on into, or starting in college algebra and ready to go through a sequence that terminates or ends in calculus or beyond. For many of our students, the reality is that college algebra was the terminal math. It felt terminal while they were taking it. They felt they were terminal in the course, and they oftentimes never take a second math after that. That is a big advantage to students who need a certain degree, a kind of math that is not related to what's taught in college algebra. College algebra, for those of you who are sort of thinking about it, it has a fair amount of abstractness, and it also has a fair amount where it builds towards fairly complex mathematical functions that are not part of the discipline, not part of most of our social science disciplines and many of our arts and sciences and humanities disciplines. So there is within that and I haven't sketched this out, but the quantitative reasoning and math modeling usually will go quantitative reasoning, math modeling, lead on to statistics, and that may be the last thing you do. But within this new model, this statistics pathway model, I want to show this out. So Barbara, you're right there. So It is not a pathway in the same sense that the college algebra pathway, the algebra pathway is. Statistics pathway begins with an understanding that elementary statistics is at the center of a constellation of study, including data science and more statistics, as well as research methods. But elementary statistics serves as a foundation for all of that. So within your disciplines, what I want to sort of get to this within each discipline, within your RACs. I would invite y'all to sort of look at and reflect upon what the best fit math is, understanding that there may not be one, but at least reflect on that for your discipline and submit a recommendation to the system office. And that, by the way, would be either to me or to Barbara. It'll all flow to me. Review that with the eyes towards elementary statistics. So now I'm going to point this out. If you're a STEM discipline, this really doesn't apply because your students have a specific path that is already stipulated. We've already said it. Certainly, if you're in a field where there's some question about this, and some of the interesting areas that have come up for discussions in both in philosophy and in what they learn in math and philosophy, and also what students need to know to be a good psychologist or to be a good sociologist. Think about whether statistics is that starting point. Think about whether quantitative reasoning math modeling is that, and what this may require is to actually go back to the math faculty at your institution to uncover what is in that course. Because one of the things that math faculty are really good at is teaching courses in mathematics. What they aren't as clear on is what they're aiming these students towards. And so there's a conversation that is historically not happened very frequently, but is really valuable between the disciplines on the one hand and the mathematics department on the other, to make sure that the expectations of the discipline are being satisfied by the course that is being offered in the math department. The current pathways we will be circulating around. I'll be actually inviting you all during this year to at least affirm, if not review and affirm, or review and update your recommendations. The pathways. The recommendations are currently in that completega.org/math-pathways link. You can look them up. They're in varying degrees of updatedness because I've gotten feedback from some RACs relatively recently, and some RACs it's been a while. Again, this information is really critical for advisor conversations. Advisors want to make sure, and both on your campus, but also for students who may be bound for training. College students want to make sure we're getting them on the right pathway going forward. And if the math course that they need to take is a specific one, it's really important that those conversations that can be had at one institution can be validated by the experience the student will have at the other. Lost my train of thought, but I'm sure it has something. Oh, one of the things, again, this conversation between math departments and discipline departments, this is not in my slides, but I'm going to encourage y'all as you go through this to think about this data science course that Barbara mentioned. We have a brand new, hot off the presses, hopefully approved, cross your fingers, do whatever you got to do, that will have a course in Gen Ed eligible for Area A, or Area D rather, eligible for Area D in data science. Data science is a booming field. It's also a really important discipline for students to understand. How do we know the world through what we see in the world, through the data in the world? So there's a big interest in this, but that course is, as it's structured, intentionally interdisciplinary. We don't do this much, and we, quite frankly, don't have a lot of experience in sort of structuring that, but it's really useful and really helpful as institutions build out that data science course. If you go into that, again, there's no obligation that you'll offer it, but if you choose to do so, to work with sister disciplines about the content and the questions that are the base of that course to reflect the content and questions that the disciplines that will be using the data science applications may want to have done. So just the thought about that, because again, these conversations between disciplines are really valuable, and they can actually be sort of formulated and framed at the RAC. So y'all's role in this is actually fairly key and critical, and I really want to thank y'all for that work. Again, my last thing, my big ask is that just as you go through your deliberations, if there is some opportunity for there being a variable math for your discipline, that as a RAC, you reflect upon it. What would be the best math? And if you don't know what's in quantitative reasoning, or what's in math modeling, or what's in college algebra, or what's in elementary statistics, reach out to your math department to find out what is offered within those courses at in your institution, and discuss and decide whether or not those math skills are the right fit for the students who going forward. Because one of the most important, powerful motivators for students in learning information that is not in their core areas of interest is, can I apply this? Does this seem to have relevance to me in my studies or in my work? So with that, I'm going to close. Barbara, I think we're giving back a little bit of time. Sorry about that. That's not ever my intention. I will take questions if you like. And again, y'all mostly know y'all actually, everybody on this call should have gotten an email from me. So you all have my email in your inbox. But I'm willing to take questions now, and I'm also always willing to take questions later on.
I think you can just unmute and speak up if you want to, because we haven't had a problem with people talking over each other. Anyone have questions on the math pathways? I want to point out, if you need just a little help on this, I put 3 links on your agenda under math pathways. The first one is just my overview from the point of view of curriculum. Then there's the Complete College Georgia Math Pathways overview, which is a little more technical. And the last one is the math recommendations that we have. And these came from your RACs over a period of years. So the math recommendations are based on you. You guys made the recommendations, Jonathan collected them and posted them. And of course, one of the things that Jonathan is interested in at this point, because the statistics pathway is kind of new, is which disciplines might recommend that students take statistics in Area A2 as their Area A2 math course. Nobody's forced to go in that direction. We're just interested in how best to advise students and to put that advice up there. Also, in that context, want to remind you that with the core rules, we can't require students to take particular courses in the core, but you can certainly recommend to students in your major that there are particular courses that might be more interesting and useful. So when we were talking about the momentum year and the 9 credit hours, so let's say you want to talk to psychology majors, well, maybe you want to recommend that they take sociology or anthropology in Area E. Or you might, I don't know if you'd have a particular recommendation for Area C. Area D right now, if you adopt data science courses, some of you may want to recommend that your students take a data science course as their 3rd Area D course. So, think about it, the math recommendations right now are the most important, but think about how also you can help to guide your students toward taking courses in the core that might be of interest to them in their majors. Anybody with questions on that? Okay, then, yeah, back to me.
Actually,
Barbara,
I'm sorry.
Dylan Williams has her hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. One of the things we were talking about data sciences and some of these other courses are cross-disciplinary kind of courses, right, that are linked to the discipline. One of the things that the department heads on the ground have talked about, or essentially are discussing, is the logistics of this, the logistics of faculty course loads, compensation, etc. What it would be great, and I don't know if there's any guidance coming from the BOR office on these issues, but that's one of the biggest hurdles to interdisciplinary work, is the actual compensation balance of workload questions that come up between disciplines and departments. So if you have any of those things, that'd be great if you could share it.
Well, this was touched on briefly by the committee developing the data science course, and maybe I don't think we're going to come up with any absolute rules, but maybe we could help by coming up with some guidelines. I know institutions will be concerned about what are the SACS credentials to teach an interdisciplinary course, and certainly sharing across departments. So maybe we can put that kind of on the list of things that the committee might discuss, Jonathan.
Sure.
Jonathan has been spearheading the development of the data science course. Anyone else? Sorry.
Yeah, this is Jennifer Trunzo. I know that at my university, we have a centralized advising office that guides students through the core, okay?
Mhm.
The RACs can put together these recommended pathways and those sorts of things, but students at my institution aren't even assigned a within major advisor until they are juniors.
Mhm.
So it's up to centralized advising to make sure that these pathways are followed, and we don't have we have very minimal input into what students are actually doing until they become juniors and they come to our offices for advising.
And that underscores the importance of this sort of feedback loop, because I mean, there's a centralized advisors are operating, you know, until we provide them with that sort of level of input, they're operating in a vacuum. And this is sort of why we saw that 70% number in college algebra, because they were operating on what is a safe assumption. So it's a really valid point that moving students into centralized advising, which has been the trend almost across the entire system in the last couple of years. And there's a lot of advantage to that, but it has an information obligation that burdens the advisor. And you know, Sharon Duhart's on from their advising RAC, and I think the conversation in advising is oftentimes like, how do we know more about X? How do we understand this? It's been the big push around why we've asked institutions to build. And again, this has been a project I've been fairly passionate about too, is why we've asked campuses to build default program maps, because that's the way. And these aren't like, you know, rigid must follow maps so much as these are ways that advisors can have an informed conversation about a student's choice. Very well taken, but again, that feedback, the RAC becomes the centralized point that allows for transfer, because this conversation might happen on your campus or might not, but it's actually even messier at transfer, because students will have had a conversation at one institution and transfer. And that's why these sort of feedback, particularly around math, but not exclusively around math, we recognize is really important. So thanks for raising it.
Well, and one of the other things that we need to consider is that many of the social sciences, many of the natural sciences, they have statistics classes for their specific discipline that are already in their curriculum.
Right.
So how do those fit into these math pathways? And another thing is, what do we do with students that should be in a statistics pathway but really need to start with math modeling? It's like, do they need to now take 4 math courses instead of 2 or 3? It becomes almost burdensome to students that are not good at math.
Sure. You know, so I'm gonna the math, the more stats, like sort of the discipline specific stats question is really interesting, because we had this conversation that as it moves into area A2, the question is, what do you then not reteach, and you know, does the area, because does that secondary stats become something that reteaches material that they've already had in area A2, which is not the intention. And equally, and Barbara knows that I don't want to get too far into prerequisite rules because they make me nervous. But we don't also want to make a prerequisite rule that blocks students out from that. Now, the question of the math modeling as a prerequisite for statistics, I'm a little bit less comfortable with, because from what we've been told and what we've seen, math modeling does not serve as a particularly good preparatory course for statistics. There's not that the sequencing doesn't necessarily doesn't necessarily innately prepare a student for statistics. So there's actually a problem with that. That if that's the expectation, that students need more math support for statistics, it's not maybe happening in math modeling. Which is why, in a way, the move into the core has been helpful, because as for campuses where 1401 is now an area A2 math, students who are less prepared are actually in learning support statistics in the same basic standards as they would be for learning support quantitative reasoning or math modeling, which means they are getting that sort of fundamental support, something they were not getting before. you know, so I don't want to say this is the perfect and ideal solution, you know, sort of pathway yet, but this is again having an understanding of where students start in their math in order to get to where they need to be in their discipline is a conversation that I really do encourage RACs to have. And again, for some social sciences, it may be that there is fundamental math skills that they must have to move forward.
Okay, I want to just, I'm looking at the chat here, and Sharon Duhart, who's the chair of the Academic Advising RAC, points out maybe some of the RACs could partner or survey with the Advising RAC about addressing some of these issues, which is a great idea. I want to point out that the Academic Advising RAC is a new RAC, or relatively new, I guess it's about 5 years old now, following the recognition that this advising is so key, and that there was a disconnect between essentially advising and what was going on with core curriculum and all of that. So the academic advisors that are on the RAC are working really hard to learn more about discipline-specific pathways, and maybe that some kind of a partnership, or maybe even a presentation from 1 or 2 RACs at these meetings about, okay, if I'm advising an anthropology major, this is what we'd like to see them do. And again, just remember there are recommendations, which is what we're talking about with advising, and then there are requirements. So we're trying to steer students in a particular direction, but not change the core requirements. We need to move on at this point because I want to finish up. I know you guys want to finish up. So one of the duties that I know you look forward to is when your RAC gets a proposal from the Council on General Education. This will happen about 4 times a year. The first time should already have happened. I think I'm a little behind, but I think I only have 1 proposal that needs to go to a RAC, and I don't remember which of you is going to be lucky. But basically, so the current process is when an institution wants to add a course to any core area, A through E, but not F, we don't look at F, they send the proposal to the Council on General Education, which I'm the liaison for. I look to see what RAC the proposal should go to. I send it to that RAC for review. The RAC usually gets 3 weeks to work on this. This time they may get 2 weeks, but we'll work on that. And then they're supposed to send it back with a recommendation, and their recommendation and the proposal get reviewed by the council at the meeting. So our first meeting is October 9th. And the proposals look overwhelming when you look at them. But really the part that the RAC has to fill out is just what we call part 2. It's a little more than 1 page, most of which is a checkbox. And the council is really interested in hearing your opinion. Council doesn't always agree with the RACs, but it's your chance to lay out points that the council might not have thought of, or just to say, you know what, this is a common numbered course. It's commonly accepted in area E. We don't see any problem with it. You know, so you don't have to be highly, highly critical, but if you see problems, the council really wants to know that. And I guarantee that the first thing that the council discusses in connection with any proposal is what the RAC said. I try to, after the council meets, I try to give you a RAC feedback on what the council did with your recommendation, just so you know that it really was taken seriously. And again, sometimes the council will disagree with the RAC and make a different decision, but that's part of the process. Otherwise, we just have the RAC make the decision. And, you know, so both parts are getting heard. The council recently looked at all its dates and tried to figure out how that impacted on the RAC. They removed council meetings that with proposals that would happen over the summer where your faculty on contract, and they tried, not fully successfully, but they tried to look at windows to send proposals to the committees reasonably within the normal faculty working time and not hopefully at super duper crunch time. So basically, when I get a proposal like that, I'll send it to the committee chair, I'll give you a deadline to respond. These almost never come up when you guys have a scheduled meeting, so we're just expecting you to handle it by email. And if you have any questions, you can always get back to me. It's probably not one of the most fun things you do, but it's the way that your RAC gets input into this whole core curriculum thing. And it's really important to us. Okay. You may, and I'm not sure of this yet, if you propose like a new degree, you send it to the system office and they review it. And at times they have also sent these out to various committees to review. I don't know if that's going to happen in the next year. I remember when I was on the psychology committee, we got like a 150-page proposal, and it was really onerous to have to review. We are, I think we're trying to trim that down. Sorry, I'm looking at, okay, I'll go back. I've got Dylan Williams in a minute. But anyway, so it's possible that you'll get new program review proposals, but those have not been coming through the pipeline lately. Now, Dylan Williams asked, what's the level of information provided to those who are making recommendations for courses in the core? We've received very many proposals for courses that were 3,000, 4,000 level courses. Are those that propose advise that this level of coursework is rarely in the core? This is almost it's mainly your committee, Dylan, that gets these. And these are almost always Georgia Tech proposals. And they're well aware. And the way they've constructed their core, there are certain courses that have to be offered at 3,000 or 4,000 level. And they keep wanting to be able to offer them in the core. And we have this conversation several times a year. They almost always get approved by the council. The RAC almost always raises questions about the level of the course. And we haven't really made too much progress. But I assure you that when Tech makes these proposals, they know what they're doing. They have representatives on the council, and they defend it as that they've got a special student population that they're trying to offer their students who have otherwise very few electives some interesting opportunities, particularly in humanities and social sciences. I can't really give you a better answer than that.
I'm sorry, this is Delynn. Yeah, we can talk offline if you want. The only question that comes up in the committee then is about all the discussions about transferability of the core. Right? We get endless conversations about transferability, and then we get a series of proposals for 3,000 and 4,000 level courses.
Well, they do transfer, because if it's part of Area E, it's part of Area E. At least that's how it's supposed to work. And the council considers that in making its decision, that if the council approves it, it transfers as part of that area. And I'm hoping that this is something that we clarify and fix with when we do Gen Ed redesign. But right now we're sort of stuck with it. You are allowed to have 3,000 and 4,000 level courses in areas A through E, as long as you have a pathway that doesn't require the taking of 3,000 and 4,000 level courses. So if you only offered 3,000 and 4,000 level courses, you couldn't do that. But as long as you have some 1,000 and 2,000 level courses as options, you can do it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, rolling up now. Resources for the RACs. I know we've fed a lot of information to you, particularly if you're new. It may seem overwhelming. I've tried to set up resources for you. You've got a lot of the links, and I'll be looking back at that and maybe sending you some additional ones. But in terms of resources for the RACs, the first thing I want to remind you of is your committee pages that I showed you how to get to before, have resources that you've developed. And here we're looking at part of the English RAC page, And I also want to remind you, you can't see it here on this slide, but these are drop downs. So there's a little triangle to the right of committee information. When you click on that, usually you just see bylaws. And then there's a little triangle to the right of related documents, presentations, and others. And when you click on that, you see these resources. And you see that here, the English committee has specified learning outcomes for English 101 and 102 for their sophomore level English literature courses. And there's a link to the Area F guidelines. And these are documents that they had posted. And below this, if we're looking at the actual page, we would also see there's a link to their minutes. So you can put resources up there that you want. You just send them to me and I post them. It's not a hassle for me to do. So those are our committee specific resources. Then on this academic committee page, you're looking at the top of the slide. You've got, on the left, you've got your choice of committees, and on the right, in that gray box, there are two choices: academic committee representatives by institution that you can look at if you want, but it's not relevant at the moment. But the academic committee resources, that's where I tried to put together a lot of the resources that we've talked about today. So there are links to roles and responsibilities, bylaws, template, etc. So if you don't want to keep this whole agenda, if you can just get yourself to the committee page and click on academic committee resources, you've got some resources there. At the bottom of this page, this same page, is a generic charge to the committees. This is not as specific as what I sent you, and it's not everything we talked about today. But the first recommendation is on those course-based credit. And then the other things that we talked about as other goals. I didn't put have meetings, keep minutes, etc. That's kind of, those are our basic housekeeping. But anyway, so hopefully these are all available to you. And I'm also a resource. And for some of these things, Jonathan is a resource, or your liaison. So going back through your priorities, credit by exam is at the top of everybody's specific charges. It's at the top here. Schedule a meeting or meetings, create or update bylaws if needed. Make sure you have succession planning in place. Remember, if you're a chair now, it's easier to get somebody to agree to be chair-elect than if it's the time for you to pass off and they immediately have to jump in. So it's in your enlightened self-interest to get a succession plan in place. You probably need to build that into your bylaws. Establish reliable methods of communicating. I mentioned to you I will update your listservs. I don't know if I'll get to it today, but certainly by Monday. If up to you, you can review your common course prefixes, numbers, titles, and descriptions. Make changes if you want. Review system-wide Area F guidelines for your area. And let me know if there are Area Fs that should be eliminated or added. And if you've already presumably made math pathway recommendations, but you can take a look at that. Talk to Jonathan if you think you might want to make any switches. Let him know if you have recommendations that are different than what he has already posted. And that is it for me. Do you guys have questions?
Barbara, for our meeting, do we also record it and send it to you?
No, you can record it for you, but you don't need to record it and send it to me. I would just like to have minutes because right now it looks like our committees haven't been meeting because there are no minutes posted, but as much as possible, what you do, I want to be for your committee. But we will post documents that you want. We definitely want to post minutes, etc. Anyone else?
So you still require the written minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I gave you a link to some thoughts about minutes. Minutes don't have to be really extensive, and you should kind of avoid saying he said or she said. So if you are not sure what needs to go in your minutes, click on one of those links. I've given you a couple of links to what's recommended for minutes, but it's really helpful, and sometimes committees end up going back to their own minutes to see what they decided 2 years ago. So I consider those sort of a real resource for your committee. I do work hard to make sure those minutes are posted when you send them to me. We have, for some reason, lost a lot of minutes from 2011 and 2012. You'll see that they're listed. If your committee is affected, you'll see that those minutes are listed, but they're not linked. I have looked. I know that they're not on the server. Unless any of you guys have copies of them, I have no way to recover them. Something mysterious happened in 2011, 2012 that resulted in a lot of minutes just getting unlinked, for which I apologize, but I can't do anything about it. But other than that, yeah, I post your minutes. I try to make sure that everything is kept in order. If you look at your webpage and there are problems with it, let me know. I will also mention that in a couple of weeks, they're moving the committee's webpage. We may have some disruption in links. I will be doing the best I can to fix it, but I believe it's the 17th through the 24th. I will not be able to make any changes to committee web pages, and we may experience some disruption. If you're seeing problems after the 24th, please let me know and I will go back and try to fix them. Anyone else? Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I know it is really hard to sit through a 3-hour online meeting, but I really appreciate that you did it, particularly that we started so early. And I feel I'm really happy with the level of interaction that took place. I'm really glad that many of you spoke up with questions, either live or via chat. And I'm really appreciative of the roles that all of you are playing with our RACs. Thank you, and I hope we're going to have a great year.